He stood in front of the entire company, summoned to the stage like a token of diversity, only to be handed a fake award wrapped in mockery. His skin color, the unspoken punchline in a room full of forced laughter and polished suits. Not a single person spoke up. Not one hand clapped with sincerity. The humiliation wasn't loud, it was carefully designed, dressed in corporate smiles and buried in a culture that rewarded silence over truth. They didn't see a strategist, a builder, or a man. They saw only what they chose to see, and in that moment, it was everything he wasn't. What they never expected was that the quiet man they erased day after day had been watching, recording, and preparing. What unfolded next would not only flip the company's foundation, but force every person in that building to reckon with the cost of looking the other way. This isn't just a story of cruelty, it's a story of revelation, where the man they tried to humiliate turned out to be the one holding the keys to a multi-billion-dollar storm. If you're ready for a series that hits deep and exposes what's often left unspoken, like the video, subscribe for more, and drop a comment below. Where are you watching from? And what would you have done if you were in that room? The morning light hit the windows of Greystar Corporate Tower with a glare that made the glass look like armor. Inside, the air was thick with silence and the subtle pressure of hierarchy. In conference room 16B, executives filled the chairs around a sleek obsidian table, each one dressed like they had somewhere more important to be. The kind of room where voices dropped and backs straightened. It was 15 minutes before the meeting, and most of the seats had been claimed, notebooks open, pens aligned, smiles tight and strategic. Calderon sat at the head of a table with a white porcelain mug in his hand, its gold-lettered initials CR visible when he turned his wrist. He wasn't a man you interrupted. His presence, even silent, seemed to fill the space with expectation. Conversations thinned the moment he lifted his gaze. Near the glass wall, between the screen and the credenza that held backup laptops and untouched bottled water, stood Ellison Wade. No one had offered him a seat. There was no chair pulled back, no folder marked with his name, no greeting when he entered. He held a dark leather folio in his hands, pressed tight to his chest like a shield. His suit was sharp, carefully chosen for the presentation he had spent 2 weeks building. He had checked and rechecked the data, sharpened every chart, formatted every color and margin to match corporate visual guidelines. He had taken pride in it. That pride felt foolish now. The air conditioning hummed, and Calder finally spoke, his voice cutting through the room like a scalpel. Everyone settled instantly. Without glancing toward Ellison, Calder launched into the first slide. A graph appeared, Q3 retention compared to competitor benchmarks. Ellison recognized it immediately. He had worked on that slide until 2 in the morning, triple-checking the source data. As the presentation continued, every slide that appeared was his. The formatting, the metrics, the visual cues, his fingerprints on all of it. But Calder didn't mention his name once. Instead, he spoke in vague terms. The team put this together. One of our junior associates ran the numbers. General, impersonal, erasing. At one point, Calder paused, studying a dip in a revenue bar. He turned his head halfway, not fully, and said, "Do we have anyone here who worked on this segment?" Ellison stepped forward slightly, his voice steady. "Yes, I did." Calder cut him off with a short, sharp laugh. "Oh, that's right. Wade, I keep forgetting you're in here. You blend in." Some people chuckled. It wasn't the kind of laugh that welcomed anyone in. It was the kind that closed a door and left it locked. Ellison stood in place. There was nothing to say. He didn't know if they were laughing at him or to protect themselves from being next. Either way, no one looked at him. They looked at the screen, at Calder, at their notepads, but not at him. As the meeting dragged on, he remained standing. The chairs were all full. No one shifted or made space. No one acknowledged the imbalance. He became part of the wall, an accessory to the room, not a person. Calder wrapped up the session by thanking everyone for their professionalism and teamwork. Then he reminded them how presence was often more important than performance. Eyes darted toward Ellison at that. The words weren't about him. They were for him. A warning dressed as feedback. As the room emptied, a few glances away, but no one stopped. Calder passed him without pause, still holding his coffee. Someone nearby muttered something that sounded like rough break, but it disappeared under the scrape of chairs and low conversation. Ellison walked back to his desk in silence. The screensaver pulsed gently on his monitor like nothing had happened. He checked his calendar. A deep dive session had been scheduled for tomorrow morning. The same project, the same data, but his name was no longer on the invite. It had been replaced. He hadn't been removed, just erased, as if he'd never been involved. At noon, the office cafeteria buzzed with conversation, laughter, the soft clinking of salad bowls and iced teas. Ellison sat alone at the far end, his ID badge clipped neatly to his belt. An entry-level staffer approached and asked if he was new. Ellison said no. The staffer apologized, then offered a smile that didn't reach his eyes and walked away. The badge had his title clearly printed, but the man hadn't bothered to read it. Back upstairs, the afternoon passed in a blur. At 3:15, Calder passed his desk without a word, dropped a stack of financials on the corner without looking, and continued down the hallway. No context, no request, no deadline, just the gesture, an order disguised as routine. Ellison read the room. He nodded, said nothing. At 5:45, the office began to clear out. Laptops closed, chairs pushed in, heels and loafers clicked on tile. Ellison stayed seated until the hallway was mostly empty. When he finally stood, his back ached. His fingers were sore from gripping the arms of his chair too tightly. He gathered his things slowly, methodically. No one said goodbye. No one made plans to include him. In the parking deck, he sat in the driver's seat of his car and stared straight ahead. The wheel felt cold. His hands rested there, not shaking, just still. He wasn't angry. Not yet. Anger would have given him momentum. What he felt was something heavier, quieter. It was the weight of being outnumbered, not in bodies, but in assumptions. The weight of knowing you were present, but still not seen. Of being corrected in public and erased in private. He looked in the rearview mirror. His tie was still straight, his collar still crisp. He had done everything right. And still, the room had made a decision about him before he said a word. He reached into his bag and pulled out the folio, opening it slowly. His notes, hand-drawn flowcharts, and highlighted trends stared back at him. Proof of effort, of value, of time. He closed it without reading further. His name wasn't on it, but the handwriting scrawled across the top in bold, blue ink was unmistakable, Calderoans. A brief note. Consolidate findings for Wednesday's briefing and make the layout more digestible. Ellison stared at it for a long moment. The report was the same he had built last week. The one Calder had claimed was unclear during the meeting. He opened the file and found all of his formatting stripped away, his notes deleted, bullet points reworded to sound generic and dry. His charts, intuitive, color-coded, and meticulous, had been flattened into grayscale columns. Every distinguishing mark of his work was gone. He felt it like a bruise. It wasn't just critique, it was revision as erasure. As the office filled, voices rose and chairs rolled back, casual banter passing overhead like storm clouds that never broke over him. Ellison remained quiet, focused, but each click of his keyboard sounded louder than it should have. Around 9:30 a.m., a new face approached from marketing. A young analyst named Seth leaned over the partition, cheerful and oblivious. "Hey," he said, "Calder wants to see both of us about the presentation visuals." "I didn't realize you were working on them too." Ellison gave a tight nod, closed his laptop, and followed Seth to the far end of the floor where Calder's glass office overlooked the city. Inside, Calder didn't look up. Instead, he tapped a file on the table. "Wade, let's see if you can clean this mess up," he said. "We need these reports to look less academic and more executive-friendly." Ellison stepped forward slowly, glancing down at the papers. They were mock-ups of his own design, now labeled as trial drafts, handed to Seth for final polishing. Calder turned to Seth, not Ellison. "You've got an eye for aesthetic," he said. "Keep it bold, simple, not so busy." He didn't need to say the rest. Ellison heard it anyway. Not so black. Not so precise. Not so obviously his. As they walked back to their desks, Seth made small talk, clearly unaware of the weight behind the meeting. Ellison responded minimally, letting the silence fill the space between them. He wasn't angry with Seth. The man didn't know better yet. But the sting deepened every time Ellison was asked to do the labor, and someone else was handed the credit. By mid-morning, the email arrived. Team members invited to tomorrow's prep review were listed by first name and department. Ellison's name wasn't among them. Yet the project in question was one he had started, one whose files still sat organized and documented on his own server access. He checked again, searching for some mistake, but there was none. Just omission. Clear. Intentional. At noon, Ellison visited the restroom mirror. He checked his shirt cuffs, straightened his tie. A colleague walked in behind him and paused. "Hey man, you've got a little shadow on your neck. Might want to trim it before the exec roundtable." Ellison blinked. He hadn't been invited to that either. He thanked the man and left, the comment lingering like a thorn under the skin. A few minutes later, he received a forwarded message from an assistant manager. Calder had sent out a grooming guideline update, apparently not company-wide, just to a handful of people. The wording wasn't explicit, but Ellison had read between lines his whole life. He was being groomed out of the picture. In the late afternoon, Calder walked by and tapped Ellison's desk, his expression blank. "We've reassigned the design deck. You can shift back to analytics cleanup. Just check formatting. Don't change anything." Ellison nodded slowly. The shift in tone was deliberate, from leader to labor, from strategist to functionary, as if his mind had been deemed too complicated for the table, but good enough for polishing crumbs. At 4:15 p.m., he sat in a private huddle room, reworking a data model no one else seemed to want. His name was no longer in the file chain. The new deck had Seth's initials on it. Ellison traced a line across the spreadsheet with his index finger, highlighting an error so obvious it twisted his stomach. A column miscalculated month-on-month churn by 7%. He fixed it. Quietly. No one would know. But if he hadn't corrected it, the mistake would have gone live, and Seth would have been blamed. Ellison saved the file, emailed the revision without note, and logged the correction in his private work journal. At 5:30, the floor began to quiet. Calder stood in his office, one hand in his pocket, the other gesturing as he spoke to someone through Bluetooth. Ellison passed by on his way out. Calder didn't look at him. Instead, he laughed at something the caller said, leaned against the desk, and looked out the window. A reflection blinked against the glass. Ellison saw himself briefly, in the pane behind Calder's head, small, blurred, and transparent. The joke of it all was that Ellison still believed in order, in merit, in proof. He still believed that good work earned recognition. But that belief was being peeled away one directive at a time, like layers of skin. By the time he reached the lobby, the receptionist barely glanced up. He stepped out into the wind, his coat tight around his chest. The air cut through him, not from cold, but from something deeper, something surgical. The new one read EW, in block letters that matched the standardized company issue format, unlike his original silver plate, which had been a gift from a former supervisor and engraved with his full name. It was gone now, without warning or request. When he asked the facilities coordinator about the change, she shrugged and said the floor redesign team had implemented new branding updates. But only Ellison's plate had changed. Everyone else's remained untouched. The explanation, like most things lately, was constructed not to clarify, but to deflect. An hour later, Calderon held a team sync in the central atrium conference space, a glass cube that offered no privacy and nowhere to hide. The meeting included 6 members from various departments and was intended to brief them on upcoming client interactions. Ellison stood by the wall while others sat. His name had been left off the official list, but one of the assistant managers waved him in as an afterthought. Calder arrived late, walked in with a stack of folders, and began distributing them. When he reached Ellison, he hesitated, then handed him the only folder without a label. The gesture was so slight, so seemingly trivial, that no one else noticed. But Ellison did. He opened the folder to find a jumble of out-of-sequence printouts, some faded, one missing a page entirely. No summary, no structure. The others had neat, color-coded packets. Ellison's was a puzzle thrown into his lap and expected to be solved on the spot. As Calder began speaking, he addressed each team member by name, referencing their past efforts, complimenting one on her insight, another on his urgency. When he reached Ellison, he paused, then chuckled without explanation and continued. The rest of the room followed his lead. It was not a joke made at Ellison's expense. It was a joke made about Ellison's place, an inside commentary shared by those who knew not to take him seriously. Every moment that followed in the briefing only added to the weight of that pause. Calder asked for input on the client's recent market shift. Ellison offered a concise analysis of historical behavior trends, referencing specific metrics. Calder ignored it entirely. Moments later, a junior analyst repeated nearly the same observation using softer language. Calder smiled and called it a smart angle. The others nodded. Ellison sat silent again. After the meeting, while team members stood near the glass doors chatting, Calder pulled aside one of the assistants and pointed at Ellison, who was still gathering his things. Calder spoke just loud enough for the words to reach the space without looking in Ellison's direction. He said they needed to recalibrate the optics of team composition, make sure representation didn't override utility. The phrase was deliberate, clinical, its meaning brutal. The assistant nodded awkwardly, said nothing, and turned away. Ellison walked to the break room where he usually kept his lunch in the second fridge. Today, it was missing. Not just moved, gone. When he checked with the kitchen staff, no one had seen it. Someone had written a note and taped it inside the fridge. Unmarked items will be discarded. But his lunch had been marked, initials clearly visible, container sealed. Still, it had vanished. He returned to his desk and sat in silence. Hunger, discomfort, and confusion swirled beneath his composed surface. He didn't leave to buy lunch. He didn't complain. He simply continued working, focusing on the numbers in front of him, letting the precision of analytics buffer him from the imprecision of his surroundings. In the late afternoon, an all-hands video call was held to discuss upcoming fiscal goals. The company president appeared on screen, followed by regional leads, department heads, and key team contributors. Names were listed in the call invitation. Ellison's wasn't among them. But 5 minutes before the meeting began, someone forwarded him the link and told him to join, saying Calder expected everyone to be there. He joined the call just in time to hear Calder referencing a trend analysis Ellison had compiled last week. The slide had been edited. The citation at the bottom now listed team collaboration. His own credentials were stripped from the footnote. A new voice explained the methodology, an associate who hadn't touched the project. As the meeting continued, Ellison's video remained muted and dark. He didn't turn on his camera. He didn't raise his hand. He took notes, observed, documented. At 5:52 p.m., with the office nearly empty and hallway lights dimmed, Calder passed Ellison's desk and dropped a comment as he walked by. No meeting summary needed from you. Let the others handle it. Rest your brain a bit. The words were wrapped in the kind of mock casual tone that dressed insult as humor. Ellison did not reply. He waited until the floor cleared completely, then opened his private log and typed for several minutes. He recorded the incident, not just what was said, but how it was said and what it meant. He cataloged the laughter, the looks, the absence of context. This file wasn't for HR. It was for clarity, a way to make sure he didn't begin to doubt his own reality. That night, he returned home and reviewed each data point. The timeline of meetings, the dates of file ownership transfers, the gradual reduction of his involvement. It wasn't just exclusion. It was strategic dilution. Every contribution fragmented, rerouted, or dissolved into team acknowledgments. His name was not just being ignored, it was being unlearned. Ellison sat in the dark for a long while, laptop screen glowing against his face. He thought about the spaces he had entered, rooms where his voice once held weight. He thought about the people who still asked him for help off the record, but never in public. He remembered being told he was too quiet, then later accused of being too assertive. He recalled being asked if he was related to the janitor with the same last name, being called articulate in tones that felt like praise and punishment all at once. His thoughts circled back to Calder, always smiling when others were watching, always sharpening knives when they weren't. The details from the previous 3 days played on loop in his mind as he settled into a seat. The erased nameplate, the absent lunch, the misattributed work, all small things, each one individually ignorable. But together they formed a pattern too deliberate to mistake for coincidence. Still, he said nothing. Still, he worked. At 8:45 a.m., an email landed in his inbox with the subject line, "Final review before client call." The message listed a required pre-meeting in the North Conference Room. Calder's name topped the invite, and all key contributors were listed below. Ellison's name, this time, was included. He hesitated, reading the details again, scanning for any fine print or hidden exclusion. There was none. The meeting was in 15 minutes. He gathered his notes and made his way across the floor. Inside the North Conference Room, the temperature was unusually low, the kind of chill that seeped into your knuckles and tightened the jaw. The long oval table was flanked by 12 chairs, and all were taken by the time Ellison arrived. At the far end, Calder leaned against the whiteboard, dry erase marker in hand, his smile wide but shallow. Ellison paused just inside the doorway, waiting for a gesture that never came. Calder tapped the marker once against his palm and said they were at capacity, but Wade was welcome to take notes from aside, gesturing vaguely toward the standing corner near the flip chart stand. Ellison stepped aside, stood tall, and opened his notepad. No one looked up. Calder began his review, clicking through slides Ellison had built, now edited beyond recognition. Terminology had been flattened, color cues removed, and key data points rounded to broader approximations that lacked the nuance he had spent days calculating. As Calder spoke, he occasionally misread the charts, attributing results to the wrong divisions. Ellison could have corrected him. He didn't. Halfway through the meeting, Calder paused and gestured to a summary chart. He asked who had handled the Q4 client onboarding visuals. No one answered immediately. Then a voice, confident and firm, piped up from the second seat. Seth, the junior associate. He claimed credit for the deck. Calder nodded without hesitation and moved on. Ellison's chest tightened, but his face remained impassive. It wasn't just the theft of work, it was the ease with which it happened, the speed at which the room accepted the new truth. When the meeting ended, Calder dismissed the team with a reminder to bring their best selves to the client call. On his way out, he stopped beside Ellison and, without making eye contact, muttered that he should consider simplifying his wardrobe for client-facing days. Maybe ease up on the cufflinks. Less can be more. Then he walked away. Ellison stood alone for a long moment before stepping into the hall. The comment echoed in his ears. The day before, it had been the beard. Today, the accessories. Always something. Always just enough to be called feedback, but never enough to mask what it truly was, a quiet rebranding of him into something less visible. Back at his desk, he opened his laptop and navigated to the team's shared drive. He clicked through file histories, watching each line of metadata shift. The owner tags no longer bore his initials. The visual identifiers he had used to structure the decks had been replaced. The comments he'd written, the formulas he had embedded, all scrubbed clean. He checked the archive logs and saw that 4 of his original folders had been deleted overnight. No notice, no justification. At 1 p.m., the catered lunch for the client prep team arrived. Long trays of food were set up in the front lounge. Ellison approached the table and scanned the list. His name was not on it. When he asked the catering lead, he was told the headcount had come directly from Calder's office. No extras. No substitutions. He stepped aside and returned to his desk. As he passed through the lounge, someone jokingly offered him a leftover box salad, half-eaten, sitting unattended. Ellison didn't respond. The humiliation wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was embedded in the systems, the routines, the tone. It lived in the smiles that faded when he entered the room, in the pauses before people decided not to ask for his opinion. It lived in the constant reminder that his presence was conditional, fragile, and dependent on compliance. At 2:15 p.m., the client joined the call. A key account worth millions. The conference room was set. The projector warmed up. Name cards were placed at the table, one for each presenter. Ellison entered just before the start. No card waited for him. Calder, standing near the screen, gestured toward the door and said they were at maximum headcount. Maybe Wade could assist from tech support if needed. The client, a seasoned executive named Breyer, gave Ellison a brief nod, but no one else acknowledged him. Ellison stepped back into the hallway, shut the door behind him, and stood by the observation glass. He watched the room like a ghost watches a home once lived in. He saw Calder speak confidently, watched the other team members take turns presenting. He knew the slide order. He could have delivered the full pitch without notes. Instead, he watched from behind the barrier, silent, invisible. As the call ended, laughter spilled into the hall. Calder opened the door and clapped one of the associates on the back, congratulating him on a clean delivery. The team dispersed with smiles and soft applause. No one asked where Ellison had gone. No one noticed he hadn't spoken a word. Later that evening, after most had left, Calder returned to his office. Ellison remained at his desk. A task had been dropped into his queue. Reorganize the data summaries for internal audit. A task fit for someone in his title, yes, but not in his skill. It was mindless work. Data sorting. Format cleansing. Busy work meant to keep him occupied, not engaged. At 6:10 p.m., he finished the job without complaint. Then he opened a blank document and began recording the full sequence of the day, each comment, each exclusion, each altered file. He logged the deleted folders, the lunch, the meeting, the silence. Each entry documented the quiet humiliations, the deletions, the altered records, the absence of acknowledgement. Each event isolated might seem petty or circumstantial, but stitched together they painted a pattern, deliberate and coordinated. He stepped onto the office floor at exactly 7:59 a.m., as always, and walked directly to his desk. This time, something new was waiting. His chair was gone. In its place stood an older, mismatched model with cracked leather and uneven arms. A small sticky note was attached to the back. Facility adjustment pending. He stood there a moment, silent, then turned and retrieved a spare chair from the side aisle near the supply closet. As he sat, he noticed his keyboard was replaced as well, the smooth ergonomic one swapped for a standard issue model, stiff and loud. No one around him looked up. It was a normal day, at least to them. By 9 a.m., the office was in full motion. Conversations rose around him, broken by laughter and the occasional ring of desk phones. Calder-Rowan walked the floor, stopping occasionally to greet associates by name, complimenting ties, referencing weekend sports, dropping inside jokes. When he reached Ellison's row, he didn't speak. Instead, he looked directly at the broken chair still leaning against the side and said to no one in particular, "Maintenance needs to declutter our aisles." Then he walked away. Ellison opened his laptop and began reviewing a model projection spreadsheet he had built for the product expansion team. The calculations were precise, the logic airtight, the predictive analytics structured to account for seasonal swings and distribution gaps. He had submitted the full report earlier in the week, with a revision request pending. As he checked the shared drive, he saw the file had been downloaded and re-uploaded under a new name, now attributed to someone else. The file structure had been slightly modified, a few column headers changed, color coding muted, but the formulas remained his. The origin tags were gone. At 10:30 a.m., a notification popped up for a spontaneous team huddle in the break room, hosted by Calder. These impromptu gatherings had become more common recently, presented as informal but carrying the weight of expectation. Ellison entered last. The room buzzed with low energy as pastries and coffee sat on a nearby counter. Calder leaned against the refrigerator, speaking casually about the importance of unity and branding consistency. As he talked, He gestured around the room and asked everyone to state one personal item that helped them start the day right. Most mentioned things like playlists, coffee routines, or podcasts. When it came to Ellison, Calder interjected before he could answer, saying, "I bet Wade just rewrites code in his sleep." Everyone laughed, the tone light but edged. Ellison gave a restrained smile, then said nothing. The conversation shifted quickly. Calder then walked over to the cabinet, opened it, and pulled out a mismatched mug, a faded ceramic one with a chipped lip. He handed it to Ellison and said they were running low on branded ones, but this would add character to the desk. Someone chuckled. Ellison looked at the mug, nodded once, and carried it back without speaking. His old mug, a gift from his sister with his full name printed in clean navy letters, had vanished from the shelf. No one mentioned it. When he returned to his desk, he placed the chipped mug behind his monitor, out of sight. The gesture wasn't about coffee. It was about positioning. It was about image. The message was clear. He didn't belong to the polished image the team presented. At noon, he walked to the kitchen to retrieve his lunch. The brown paper bag he had marked with his initials was still there, but now someone had scrawled over the letters with a thick black marker, making it unreadable. He opened the bag and found his container had been replaced with a generic one, not his usual brand, and the contents were altered. A different sandwich. No fruit. No note. Someone had swapped it. Not by mistake. Deliberately. He didn't eat it. He put the bag back and left the room, returning to his desk where he sipped water in silence, while others discussed lunch plans and shared leftovers. At 1 p.m., Ellison received a calendar invite to a creative brainstorm session. The topic was development of a new dashboard interface for a major client. He had submitted the initial concept design 2 weeks prior. The invite named 5 other participants but listed him last, without designation. When he entered the meeting room, he saw his mock-ups printed and pinned to the corkboard. Calder arrived shortly after, followed by Seth and 2 other junior analysts. Calder gestured to the board and said the design needed refinement, less clutter, more balance. He then pointed to Ellison's design and asked, "Who drafted this wireframe again?" Before Ellison could respond, Seth said he had built the concept off legacy slides. Calder nodded, said that made sense, and suggested they revisit the color scale to better reflect the company's culture tone. The meeting continued without further mention of Ellison. He contributed nothing. He was not asked to. Afterward, he returned to his desk and wrote down every detail. The words used, the pauses, the reattribution of ownership. At 3 p.m., a mail delivery arrived. Envelopes were handed out across the department, client thank you notes sent in bulk. Ellison received nothing. When he asked the mail clerk if more were pending, the man said no, everything had been sorted and matched to the most recent contribution roster. Ellison's name was not on that list. He wasn't even a footnote. The pattern was no longer just evident, it was undeniable. His identity was being reduced to an operational outline, faceless, passive, replaceable. The space he occupied was shrinking. The room left for his dignity narrowing. His chair was gone again. In its place stood a temporary visitor's stool, metal legs unpadded, too low for his desk. He looked around, expecting an explanation, but none came. He reconnected the monitor, adjusted his posture, and began the day as he had every other, composed, present, prepared. At 9:15 a.m., an email arrived from Calder Rowan's office, marked urgent. Executive recognition ceremony in main hall. All staff required. Dress accordingly. The subject line carried weight, its tone commanding. Ellison read it twice before checking the details. The event was set for 11 a.m. sharp. As the time approached, the entire floor began moving with rare urgency. People freshened up in the restrooms, adjusted collars, reapplied makeup, and rehearsed polite phrases. The recognition ceremony was a quarterly ritual Calder had implemented, designed to showcase high performers and increase visibility for rising talent. Ellison had never been acknowledged during these ceremonies despite managing projects that generated measurable growth. This time, his expectations were set at 0. He wasn't attending out of hope. He was attending because to skip it would be labeled non-compliance. At 10:57 a.m., he walked to the main hall with steady steps, his face unreadable. Inside, rows of seats faced a small platform dressed in the company's color palette, banners lining the walls with slogans about teamwork and leadership. Calder stood near the stage, smiling as employees entered, shaking hands and offering casual compliments. Ellison stood near the back, just inside the doorway, uncertain whether a seat was available for him. None were. He remained standing. The lights dimmed, the projection screen lit up with a looped highlight reel showing company outings, deal closings, team photos. Then Calder took the stage. His voice, rich and rehearsed, carried easily. He spoke about excellence, about culture, about how leadership revealed itself not through title, but through visibility and presence. As the speech progressed, Calder called names one by one. People stood, smiled, walked to the front, received embossed certificates and firm handshakes. The applause was consistent, always loud enough to satisfy the moment, but never so loud as to drown out the next name. Then Calder paused and turned toward the crowd with exaggerated enthusiasm. He said there was one more name on the list, a name that deserved special recognition for versatility and commitment to every corner of the building. He then gestured toward the side and invited Ellison Wade to the front. The room shifted. Heads turned. The applause began slowly, confused, uncertain. Ellison hesitated, his feet rooted in disbelief. He hadn't been told in advance. He hadn't prepared. And the tone in Calder's voice was not one of celebration but performance. Ellison walked forward slowly, passing rows of polite claps and wary smiles. Calder extended a hand with a smirk and held out a lanyard. Not a certificate, not a plaque. A lanyard with a badge holder attached. Inside the holder was a slip of paper with the word Operations Support Liaison typed across it, and beneath it in smaller font, Facility Visitor Access. The room laughed, small and awkward at first, then louder, fed by Calder's exaggerated grin. Calder said Ellison had been everywhere, touched every team. Maybe it was time he had a badge to match. The joke was clear. The title meant nothing. The role didn't exist. The lanyard wasn't ceremonial. It was a humiliation, a final joke wrapped in corporate camouflage. Ellison took the lanyard slowly, looked at it, then looked at Calder. He didn't speak. He didn't smile. He turned back to the crowd, nodded once, and walked off stage. The applause was quiet this time, uneasy, forced. Back at his desk, he placed the lanyard in his drawer without a word. The file waiting on his screen was one he had been compiling for days, an internal report meant for the audit committee. His task was to summarize operational inefficiencies across departments. But the irony was unbearable now. He stared at the screen, the blinking cursor like a taunt. Then he opened a separate document. He began to write, not for the audit, but for himself. He documented the ceremony in brutal detail. The expressions, the reactions, the phrases used, the laughter. The moment Calder called his name, everything. At 2 p.m., Calder passed by his desk and said nothing about the ceremony. Instead, he dropped a folder of maintenance requests and said these needed logging into the shared system. The folder was filled with custodial updates, janitorial reports, requests for broken lights, damaged office chairs, cracked window panes. Not his job, not his level. But again, nothing was said. Ellison logged each item carefully, precisely. No complaint, just quiet obedience. In the break room later that afternoon, he noticed his name had been removed from the team bulletin board. The space where his picture had once been small and barely noticed was now replaced by an inspirational quote about resilience. The irony twisted like a hook behind his ribs. At 4:30 p.m., the floor manager circulated a survey asking employees to rank their experiences with leadership. Ellison received the link but deleted it without opening. There was no need. They didn't want honesty. They wanted compliance. Before leaving that evening, Ellison packed his things slowly. He looked at the chipped mug still behind his monitor. He didn't move it. He didn't take it home. He wanted it to stay there as a reminder. Not for them, for himself. On his way out, he passed the main hallway and saw a new poster being pinned up beside the elevators. Photos from the day ceremony. Calder smiling, the team clapping. Ellison, in the background, lanyard around his neck, frozen mid-step, face blank. He passed through security with a nod, climbed the elevator in silence, and sat at his desk without turning on his computer. Instead, he opened his personal laptop, discreet, unconnected to company systems, and inserted a drive marked only with a single label, LRN Delta. The files within had been compiled over months. Screenshots of altered documents, timestamp changes, access logs, calendar entries, forwarded emails, internal file transfers, surveillance metadata, badge access records, and most importantly, a complete forensic map of ownership chains across every project where his name had been removed, replaced, or repositioned. It wasn't revenge that moved his fingers now. It was truth, long hidden, long denied, quietly prepared and sharpened in silence. By 8:20 a.m., the office began to stir around him. The usual greetings floated through the air, background noise meant to reinforce a culture of performance and politeness. Calderon strolled past his desk at 8:33, coffee mug in hand, eyes scanning the floor without landing on Ellison. He made no mention of the lanyard ceremony, no acknowledgement of the mockery. Ellison didn't look up. He had nothing more to ask, nothing more to expect. He continued working silently, opening folders, cross-referencing files, noting inconsistencies in slide attributions and resource logs. By 9 a.m., he had built a sequence that would be impossible to explain away. The files spoke for themselves, numbers, edits, source metadata, all pointing to a concerted, layered effort to silence, marginalize, and rebrand his contributions as belonging to others. He had not spoken a word of protest in months, but his silence had not been passive. It had been strategic. At 9:45 a.m., an email pinged across the department. Emergency briefing. All department leads required. Calder's name sat at the top of the chain. The reason cited was an urgent realignment of partner expectations following a failed compliance threshold in last month's audit. Ellison read the message without reacting. He knew exactly what the issue was. He had flagged it weeks ago in a report that was deleted and replaced under another team's name. He stood, adjusted his tie, and walked toward the conference room not as a ghost, not as a background function, but as a man with something the others didn't know he carried. Inside the conference room, the tension was immediate. Calder stood at the front, flanked by 2 division managers and a director from compliance. A projector displayed a complex flowchart riddled with red markers and warning symbols. The problem was clear: duplicated data streams, incorrectly forecasted growth curves, and potential misreporting to a major partner client. Calder's tone was measured but sharp, asking pointed questions to the room about how such an oversight occurred. One by one, managers offered explanations: team shuffles, onboarding gaps, unclear documentation. Ellison watched them stumble. Then Calder asked who had overseen the initial data input. No one answered. Ellison stepped forward. "I did." The room froze. Ellison's voice was calm, flat, undeniable. "I flagged this in Report Delta 3 nearly 6 weeks ago. It was removed from the system on September 12th. At 9:46 a.m., the version uploaded afterward was attributed to the expansion division, but it used a model I built, version 1.7, to be specific." He turned to the screen, pointing toward the lower right corner. "That growth curve there is built off my original formulas. The labeling was changed, but the structure is mine. I can show you the logs." The room remained silent. Calder's face, usually unreadable, twitched for the briefest second. "I have full revision history," Ellison continued. "I've tracked every overwrite, every metadata change, every file transfer, reassignment, and deleted record. I've documented each meeting where attribution was shifted, every internal memo where my name was excluded despite primary contribution." The tone was clinical, not angry, not accusatory, just clean and surgical. "I also have time-stamped security footage and internal access logs that confirm badge entries tied to these edits. They're on an encrypted drive, authenticated. The compliance director straightened. "We'll need to see that." Ellison handed her a slim drive from his pocket, the label clean and unmistakable. "Source integrity, archive." Then he turned toward Calder and added, quietly, "And just to be clear, this isn't personal. This is procedural. Truth should never depend on popularity." Whispers traveled faster than emails. People who had previously passed him in silence now nodded with a strange mix of guilt and curiosity. Some offered tight smiles, others gave him space. It wasn't warmth, and it wasn't respect, not yet. But it was different. Calderon did not appear on the floor that morning. His office light remained off, his door shut. The usual parade of assistants and analysts who orbited him had thinned. The man who had once towered over the floor with casual arrogance now existed only as a closed door and a dozen rumors. Ellison sat at his desk and opened his laptop, not to work, but to review. The archive he had submitted was now part of a formal investigation, and although the document spoke for itself, today would be about filling in the gaps. Context, motivation, pattern. He had not built the file for revenge. He had built it because truth had weight, and the only way to make others feel that weight was to let the evidence speak louder than outrage ever could. Just before 9 a.m., a calendar invitation appeared on his screen. Executive Council session. Closed room briefing. Attendees required. Ellison was listed first. He clicked accept without hesitation. At 10 a.m., he stepped into the executive wing, a space usually reserved for senior directors and C-level meetings, a space where he had only ever entered to drop off materials or retrieve forgotten printouts. Today, he walked in as an equal. Inside the room, 3 high-level executives sat along one side of the table, folders open, tablets illuminated. Across from them stood the head of internal compliance, the HR vice president, and one of the company's legal counsel representatives. There was no one smiling, no one pretending. This was not theater. It was audit. It was consequence. At the end of the table sat Calder, no longer postured with power, but hunched slightly, arms crossed, his voice absent. Ellison was asked to speak first. He did not read from notes. He didn't need to. Every incident had been lived, memorized, engraved. He walked them through his first exclusion. The slow, strategic erasure for meetings, the reassignment of credit, the repeated denial of access, the physical and psychological reduction from core contributor to invisible support. He described the public lanyard incident with unflinching clarity, the false recognition used as a tool to mock his status. He outlined the exact timeline of project ownerships, email deletions, and silent rebranding of work, all coordinated or permitted by Calder. And then he spoke of the silence, how no one had intervened, how each nod and absence of objection had enabled the behavior to grow. Not all of it was malicious, he admitted. Some of it was culture. But culture left unchecked becomes cruelty. When he finished, the room did not move. No one spoke. The silence now was not avoidance. It was reckoning. Calder was given the opportunity to respond. He leaned forward, tried to laugh, said it was all miscommunication, that things were never meant personally, that the decisions were performance-based, not personal. But as he spoke, his voice cracked around the edges. He claimed Ellison had misread intentions, that the reassignments had been strategic, that visibility in a company like this was fluid, that not every contribution could be acknowledged individually. He said these things with the forced confidence of a man who had repeated them so often they sounded true to himself, even now. Then came the moment Ellison had prepared for, the final reveal, the detail he had withheld from his initial report, not because it was insignificant, but because it was damning enough to end the denial altogether. He pulled a separate folder from his bag and placed it on the table. Inside were 2 printed email chains. The first was from a month ago, in which Calder had messaged a department lead instructing them to strip Ellison's name from a client-facing slide deck, stating directly that Wade's background wasn't a fit for executive optics. The second was a private message between Calder and another manager in which he referred to Ellison as a placeholder who cleans up but doesn't shine, followed by a laughing emoji. The room shifted. One of the executives closed her folder slowly. The HR vice president's jaw tightened. Calder didn't speak again. He leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on the ceiling. Ellison said nothing else. He gathered his things, nodded once, and left the room. As he walked back through the halls, the quiet seemed different. Not hostile, not indifferent, just unsure. His colleagues watched him pass. They didn't look away this time. Some looked down. Some looked directly at him. A few nodded. One person mouthed the word sorry, but he kept walking. Back at his desk, his inbox was flooded. Apologies, requests for clarification, messages from executives, HR notices, a calendar invite from the chief operating officer, praise wrapped in caution, curiosity dressed as concern. He answered none of them. Instead, he opened the one message that mattered, an invitation from the External Ethics Review Board. They wanted to speak with him directly, not as an employee, as a witness. At 1:30 p.m., he went to the break room for the first time in 3 days. The chipped mug was gone. Someone had replaced it with a fresh, company-branded one. He left it untouched. He poured his water into a plain glass and sat alone, but for once, he wasn't invisible. People walked past. Some said his name, full name, not just initials, not just a nod, not just a glance. Ellison Wade. It felt strange to hear it again in full. Strange and right. Ellison Wade entered the floor at the usual time, and for the first time in over a year, there was no subtle erasure waiting at his desk. His monitor was plugged in. His chair was in place. His nameplate, which had mysteriously disappeared, had returned with full engraving, polished and centered. It hadn't just been replaced. It had been restored deliberately, as if the building itself was trying to make amends. But Ellison did not mistake gestures for justice. He had learned too well that systems only changed when truth made denial impossible. At 8:30 a.m., an executive bulletin was circulated to all staff. The message, signed by the chief operating officer, confirmed an independent review of recent personnel mismanagement and announced interim disciplinary measures. Calderon had been placed on indefinite unpaid leave, pending final review from legal and ethics compliance. The bulletin didn't mention Ellison's name, but everyone knew. For the rest of the morning, Ellison fielded soft apologies wrapped in pleasantries. A director from another floor stopped by his desk and said she was impressed by his professionalism. A former team lead asked if they could pick his brain sometime. One associate brought him coffee. Ellison accepted nothing, but gave each person a polite nod, a measured thank you, and then returned to his work. He didn't trust the praise, and he didn't resent it. He simply knew what it was, response to gravity. The truth had weight, and they were only now learning how to carry it. Around noon, Ellison was invited to a closed-door session with compliance and human resources. He walked in with no documents, no laptop, no files. Everything had already been said. The room held the same 3 executives from the prior briefing, but this time there was no defensiveness in their posture. They thanked him for his transparency. They said the review had revealed not only misattributed credit, but a long-standing pattern of strategic marginalization that directly violated company values. Calder's actions had not been isolated incidents, but symptoms of a tolerated culture that prioritized image over integrity. Then they asked Ellison if he would like to remain in his current position or explore a leadership track within another division. They offered training, mentorship, flexible placement. They said the choice was his. He listened without interruption. Then he asked a single question: will this review lead to permanent cultural reform or just a procedural fix? The room fell quiet for a moment. Then the HR lead admitted they didn't know. The company had never faced such a structured, evidence-based exposure of internal bias. They hoped it would lead to deeper change. Ellison said he'd consider the offer. He didn't accept. He didn't reject. He asked for time. Not out of hesitation, but because he had spent so long forced to react that he would not be rushed now that control had returned to him. That afternoon, the first wave of recalibration swept across the department. Files were retagged. Credit logs were corrected. Ellison's original work on high-profile decks was reinstated. his name printed clearly across deliverables that had once omitted him. A mass email from operations acknowledged previous discrepancies in reporting structure. The phrasing was sanitized, but the meaning was clear. Co-workers began treating him not as a technician, but as a strategist. One asked his opinion in front of a client. Another offered to loop him into planning calls. The same people who once overlooked him now pivoted to position themselves near him. But Ellison engaged selectively, answering only when necessary, directing attention back to the data, not the drama. At 3:45 p.m., he received an internal notification. Calder had officially vacated his position. His name was removed from project dashboards and internal lists. By 4:10 p.m., IT had disabled his credentials. The office that once housed his quiet dominance now sat empty, stripped of its signature decor, its glass walls barren. Ellison passed it once on his way to the printer, glanced inside, and saw only a single chair, a scuffed corner of the carpet, and the faint impression left behind by a desk that had been removed earlier that day. Calder's voice was gone, but the echoes lingered. Before leaving, Ellison returned to his own workspace and opened a final document from his encrypted archive. It contained not just the timeline of mistreatment, but a reflective record of his own responses, when he stayed silent, when he observed, when he documented instead of defending. He had built it not just to expose wrongdoing, but to remind himself why he hadn't exploded when the weight of injustice pressed daily against his spine. On the 10th day, the building exhaled. The air inside Greystar Tower felt lighter, not because the tension had vanished entirely, but because the source of corrosion had been cut away. People walked the halls with a new rhythm, not entirely free from discomfort, but tempered by awareness, like survivors adjusting to sunlight after too long in the dark. Calder-Rowan's absence was no longer a whispered novelty. It had become part of the landscape. His name still appeared in old memos and archived emails, but live conversations rarely invoked it. When it did come up, it was in cautionary tones, the kind reserved for people who once held too much power and lost it all in a blink. Yet even amid this quiet reckoning, Ellison Wade remained steady. He had never sought to become a symbol, and he refused to let himself be framed as one now. He arrived early as always, his suit crisp, his stride clean, his presence unobtrusive but undeniable. The leadership team had extended formal apologies. Human Resources had completed the investigation. Policies were being redrafted. Department heads were now required to rotate visibility across contributors. Credit logs had been updated. Feedback channels reopened. A weekly ethics forum was scheduled, not for show, but with actual authority behind it. His name was printed in the new policy draft under acknowledgments. He asked for it to be removed. It wasn't about him, not anymore. It never had been. He wasn't there to be the hero of someone else's redemption arc. He was there to do his work, and quietly, deliberately he did. But something else had begun to shift, not only in the system around him, but in the man who had once been the face of its cruelty. Calder-Rowan did not vanish completely. Following his removal, he had gone silent. The standard procedure for cases of internal ethical misconduct often ended with termination, severance negotiation, and a permanent mark left off record by legal compromise. But Calder hadn't taken the exit package. Instead, 2 weeks after his removal, he requested a mediated meeting, not with leadership, with Ellison. The request came through a neutral third-party facilitator, a corporate ombudsman brought in from outside the organization. The message was simple. Calder-Rowan had asked for an opportunity to speak face-to-face. Ellison considered it for an hour before replying. He agreed, not out of curiosity or revenge. He agreed because the final step in this kind of story wasn't about punishment. It was about reflection. Power only changed when forced to see itself clearly, and sometimes the only mirror strong enough was the one held by the person it once sought to erase. The meeting was set in a neutral office downtown, away from Greystar Tower, away from the boardrooms and glass walls and internal politics. A simple room, 1 table, 2 chairs, no audience, no documents, no HR scripts, just 2 men. one who had spent a career towering above others, and one who had learned to endure without flinching. When Calder entered, he looked smaller, not physically, but less certain. The performative confidence that had once shaped every gesture was gone. He sat down and said nothing for a moment. Then he began. He didn't start with excuses. He didn't blame stress or company culture or inherited habits. He said he had been wrong. He said the structure of success had taught him to prioritize comfort over character, and that comfort had always come from surrounding himself with reflections of his own image. He admitted that Ellison had been more than competent, that he had been essential, but Calder had chosen to diminish him because acknowledging his contributions would have disrupted the curated narrative Calder had built around himself. He said it wasn't conscious at first, but once he realized how easily Ellison absorbed the mistreatment without retaliation, he leaned into it. He knew others were watching. He also knew no one would stop him. The more silent Ellison became, the more Calder felt justified in pretending that silence meant weakness. But it hadn't been weakness. It had been strength that Calder didn't recognize, because he had never possessed it himself. Then he did something Ellison did not expect. Calder offered no defense, no request for forgiveness. Instead, he said he had entered therapy. Not company-mandated, personal. He said he'd spent years mistaking dominance for leadership, control for respect. He said he understood now that being feared had never earned him loyalty, and being admired had never made him better. What made him better, if he could be better, was facing what he'd built and dismantling it piece by piece. He said that if Ellison never spoke to him again, he'd accept it. That if the world never let him lead again, he'd accept that too. He said his path forward wasn't redemption, it was accountability. And he wanted Ellison to know he had begun walking it. Then he stood, nodded once, and walked out of the room. Ellison sat there for a long time after Calder left. He didn't feel triumphant. He didn't feel closure. What he felt was clarity. The kind of clarity that only comes when the story bends not toward revenge, but toward repair. Back at Greystar Tower, weeks passed. New hires arrived. Old systems were restructured. The change wasn't fast. It wasn't flawless, but it was visible. Managers now called on every team member in meetings. Project logs required digital signature from all contributors. Quarterly recognition ceremonies were now peer-nominated, not handpicked. Ellison was nominated once. He declined. He didn't need applause. He needed the system to stay honest. One afternoon, he found himself in the break room with a new associate, a quiet young man, nervous, clearly sharp, unsure of his place. The associate asked him how long he'd been at the company. Ellison answered plainly, long enough to know when a voice matters. The associate nodded, confused but respectful. Ellison handed him a small folder. Inside was a blank project log sheet, a format he'd created. No logos, no flair. Just space for ideas, dates, credit, and notes. The associate asked what it was. Ellison said it was a way to remember who built what. A simple record. A start. Then he left the break room. Outside, the sun hit the tower glass with sharp angles, catching Ellison's reflection for a moment. But it didn't hold. He wasn't looking for his own image anymore. He was watching the door, the people coming in and out, the way they looked at each other, the way they stood. There was no plaque in the lobby for what had happened. No banner. No company-wide story. But that was fine. Because the real story wasn't meant to be a headline. It was meant to be a pattern breaker. A lesson. And Ellison had delivered it not through anger, not through spectacle, but through truth sustained over time. Power had looked at him and seen nothing. And in return, he had shown it everything. The end. If you connected with this story and want to see more like it, don't forget to like and subscribe to support the journey. I'd love to hear what you think. What part of the plot stood out to you most? Which moment hit hardest? And where in the world are you watching from? Drop a comment below and let's talk about it. Your voice helps shape the next chapter.